We'll go ahead and get started with the session on flowing content into layout. I'm the chair for this session, Steve Simsky. If you don't know me, many of you do. The author that's here will also be quite familiar to most of you, unless you've only been to the prior event in Sao Paulo, in which case his paper was presented by yours truly, and definitely a step down. But we get the step back up again this year as Fabio is going to present to us Pagination, Dynamic, and Web Content, which focuses on dynamic reflowing, which will be a theme throughout this session. Fabio, please.
Thank you. Thank you. So, outline of the paper. First of all, why we want to paginate web content. For web content, I mean documents that are sent through the web, or they are in XML content. And then we will go through and see how this could be done using an extension of the Galley concept. I'm going to introduce what a Galley is. And when the Galley model is built, now we have the possibility to address areas of documents in reflowable documents that usually are not addressable by the current techniques and technologies. And then a little bit more about, well, now we have a layout, we can paginate, we can flow, but how we can create a sequence of pages based on the amount of content. And I will show how current technology like XSLFO can come to the rescue and help you solve them. And the final part is, now that we have all this technology, is it possible to leverage it for a broader set of documents and not only XML or HTML document, and how this could be interacting with the devices and the deliverable mechanism. So first of all, why we bother about paginating content? First of all, the designer, which design content and web documents has only the possibility of designing for certain class of device. And this was, discussed in the keynote of yesterday. And pagination also is an aspect that is related only to certain devices. So clearly, printers require paginated content. Other devices may not need so. But if we extend the set of devices the user want to use, and this is a trend which is emerging. We have so many other devices now that we can use compared to the past, like internet-enabled televisions, smartphones, tablets, and you name it. Sometimes there could be an interest in having paginated content even on these devices because it's easier to browse it, it's easier to go through it, and it's more convenient for the user. It's all about user experience. And of course, the designer is what really is looking is at making the best usage of the document structure and the presentation aspect to make the user have the best experience out of it. So one aspect is the device explosion. So designers now are facing tons of devices they cannot handle all of the different nuances and platforms. The second aspect is that users also can start to have a different interaction with these devices. And definitely a designer cannot predict the way the user will use these devices in conjunction. So definitely printing from any of the devices that we currently have at our disposal will require pagination. But as I said before, maybe sending document to a larger estate like a television screen from our handheld devices may require pagination when we are using these devices as a remote control. It's easier to go through or use a remote control like, previous page, next page, than having to have a mouse or a keyboard or any of the other stuff. So pagination is becoming more relevant even if when we are connecting devices and using devices in different solutions. So the other aspect is designer wants to make sure that the design is providing the best experience possible for a user. So a document like this, which is relatively simple, there is a picture, some text, and footnotes, will be presented like this when it's rendered on a page. A designer will typically design this as 3 areas: a header, a body, and a footnote. And if you take a designer design this in visually driven tools like InDesign or WorkExpress that will generate areas for each of these elements, and they will make sure that the content is correctly positioned and everything like that. But what happens if I have a tool that is semi-automated? So it takes the content and then it flows it across several pages. I cannot predict when there are footnotes. I cannot predict any of this. So tools like text and XSLF4 rendering engines will allow you to identify areas that are growing as needed, and those are called usually Galley. So the size of it is not prefixed, is on demand, will appear wherever is necessary, and it will definitely, there will be rules of how much it can grow based on where the references or anchor are positioned in the content. And the content that goes and flows in those footnotes are usually called out-of-flow content because they are generated within the flow. They have a flow anchor point, but they don't recede into the main flow. They are placed in a region that is outside the flow itself. And so if we go to something more complicated like this, let's say I have a typical spread of a book or a magazine. I have two sides. I have some footnotes in an area, and I have side notes. Is another interesting case. A designer, again, will design in a static layout environment every single area as a separate one, and then it will make sure the content flows correctly. But again, if I do automate this with the Galley model, then I will have these elements within those regions to be a Galley. And as you can see, the one on the left, the body on the left, basically has a Galley which is reduced to 0 because no footnotes happen to appear in that particular part of the document. In XSLFO, text, and other languages, the Galleys are always usually implicit. So I define concept of footnotes, side notes, floats, and all this kind of stuff, but I don't specify them in the layout. I have no way of directing, positioning them, and referencing the layout. So the approach introduced here is to allow a designer to actually specify the existence of those galleys and name them. So considering the previous example, we're going to have, in this case, two regions, but then the designer can design Galley. So you can say, my content Galley is a portion of the body region, which is, let's say, 85% of it. And you see that there is I use a stacking mechanism, top to bottom or left to right, for creating and combining the different galleys. So the footnote, can be expressed using a wrapper. I can have an extent that is variable. So then I have a gap, which I use to separate my main content from my footnotes, and then I have a footnote Galley. And in this example, I use 10% for the gap and 90% for whatever the footnote is. But also, I can say that my Galley can expand, and I can now fix what is the maximum expansion. So I can control not only based on rules of where the links or the anchor appears, but also I can use this to say, well, I don't care how much footnote content you will have in that page. I don't want to get more than 50% of the available space. And this is really to control the aesthetics. Designer will do that in a static environment, a static layout, to make sure that the document is going to look good. Where in a dynamic or dynamically generated document, usually they have no control over it, beside keeping strategies, breaking strategies, and stuff like that. Now that this has been introduced, we can do fairly sophisticated layouts. For instance, we can also use this to generate quotes. There could be pull quotes or side notes. We can have columns, and we can have columns wrapper and gaps. And so we can create documents that are fairly sophisticated. So you see I created a document which has basically 4 columns, has gaps between the different columns, and then has subgroups with the relative footnotes. So this is a fairly sophisticated design that designers are used to deal with, but when it gets automated or dynamic, it becomes fairly sophisticated. And especially controlling, for instance, things like where the footnotes goes on all these different columns is a fairly sophisticated task to achieve. So now that we are able to point to our galleys, so we have a way of construct a document where galleys are explicit, we can start to think about, okay, now I can reference them and I can point some of the content, especially the out-of-the-flow content that I have in my documents, to some specific galleys. So in that way, I can control where things are going and in which way those are showing in my document. So let's start with something simple, like the previous example. We have a footnote galley, we have the bold of the document, which is our content area, and we have a side note and two gaps, a footnote gaps, and a M stand for marginalia is another name of called side notes. So first of all, I have some main content that I want to flow, so that will go probably within my content area. But then whenever there are out-of-flow footnotes happening within my content, I want them to be redirected to my footnote element. Same for the side notes. Anytime there is a side note, I want that to be referred to the side note area. So how to do that? The idea is to generate a separate representation for the mapping strategy. So the role map will be this part of the document completely separate from our pagination description, which I showed before, and it will allow me to specify what goes where. And the concept of role is that will be based on what the out-of-flow or flow role I want to assign to them. It's very simple. So let's start with a simpler concept, the main flow. And I'm going to have a role which says content, and it says I take whatever URI I want, and I put it to a destination, which is my galley, associated galley with it. And then I keep going and produce other assignment. And now the role can be footnotes, for instance, and the content galley will be my source, and the destination will be my other galley, which is the footnote galley. And I can do the same with the side notes and so on and so forth. So now I can build a set of assignments which determine what type of content, what type of role in or out of flow, and where it's generated and where the content should be redirected. This is very similar for people that are familiar with XSLFO. This is, in XSLFO there is a flow map. The difference is that the flow map in XSLFO doesn't have any concept of role. So I've been working on XSLFO for many years now, and part of this is becoming a proposal for XSLFO 2.0. But what I realize is that using this kind of technique with roles can broaden up the aspect from just being FO-driven to more a generic approach. And again, another interesting thing is that now, using the same simple way of expressing things, I can obtain fairly sophisticated things. For instance, that's my main flow. What I want the flow to go from the first column to the second column and then third and fourth column. So flow throughout the document. That's pretty straightforward. I have whatever my content is, and I can also have many sources. So I could have like 5, 6, 10 sources that will be rendered in sequence, okay? And so in the same way, the destination is taken in sequence, so they will go from one to the other and so on and so forth. But then I have my out-of-flow content like footnotes. So in the case of the footnotes, if they happen to be on the first part of the page, in the first two columns, what I usually want to do is that I want them to appear in the footnote area that belongs to that two columns. But if they overflow, I want them to move into the B area, because naturally they pertain to the same page. So in order to do that, I create a new assignment where now the sources of my out-of-flow content are the two columns, and then they will move into footnote A and footnote B. Similarly, following the rule of the content, right? Flowing between the two. But when I go to the column 3 and 4, though, I don't want them to go back to footnote A, of course. I want them to be fixed and just be rendered within the footnote B. So if a document like this gets only a reference in the column 3, you will see the footnote area A, it doesn't exist, and the footnote area B will appear with the footnote. Which, again, I said, in a dynamic document environment is not that trivial. And the other aspect is quotes. Quotes now, I have a single area for the quotes, so wherever the quotes happen, I don't care, column 1, column 2, or 4, they will all go to my quotes area. So far, so good. That's pretty simple. And the other interesting aspect that now, because I have elevated galleys to a first-class citizen, even gaps, which are usually spacer that the engine will put to separate the generation of the galleys, are directly referable, which allows me to pour content into it, which is particularly interesting because I can, instead of having just a built-in rule or line to separate my footnotes or to separate the columns, I can pour in, for instance, SVG. I can have decorations, I can have patterns, I can have anything I want. It behaves like content, and I can refer it to my gaps, and in that way they can be assigned. And as you see, I use a decoration role. So the other point is this: the role names are really user-dependent and user-defined. Everybody could define their own. Defining them using a standard way, though, will provide me advantage that I will introduce later. If I can find a common name or a namespace that are common, will allow me to do some interesting modifications to the document and repaginate them and reflow them accordingly. But nothing stops me to generate galleys and assign content role that I invented. Examples, figures, you name it. So what about pagination and flowing? So now we got these pages, we got the galleys designed in it and everything applied. But how the content actually get generated and how I determine how many pages do I have? And now I figured out how the content that ends in page 1 will be rendered in a further page and linked automatically to whatever my page and galley model will be. So XSLFO comes to the rescue in this respect. So XSLFO is a pretty extensive way of doing pagination. So let's say I have designed 2 pages, an odd page and an even page. So for simplicity here, I just contracted the expression of these pages, where it would be a little bit too long. But I have a page master, I have a region, and then I have a certain galleys inside, and then you can imagine how I have designed those galleys. So once I have these 2 pages, I can simply generate a role map for it, and just for now focusing on the content aspect of it, so how the content will move from one another. And then I use the FO description of page master sequencing, and in this case I want to have a master alternative, so I want to have even and odd pages, okay? And so the condition is when the page is either odd or even, you use one or the other. And the other thing is that I have a repeatable page sequence master, so this will be repeated until the content is exhausted. When I finish the content, I will stop paginate. So the way it works is that the main flow will be assigned to the odd page. Let's say page 1 will be the first one to start. So my role map will actually say that the content needs to go from column 1 to column 2. So it will do exactly that. But when I finish here, then the fact that I have an even page, because my page counting will be 2, it will say, oh, you need to go to the even page now and render there. So the layout of the even page will be considered now instead of the layout of the odd page, but the flow map, the role map is exactly the same. And so what I will do, I will continue on column 1 from column 2. And then again, column 1 to column 2. And when I ended up here, the next page is again an odd page, and the role map still the same, so I go back and I continue on column 1. And I will continue indefinitely because I have my repeatable, or indefinitely until I have content to render. So this is the way XSLFO pagination works, and it can be applied, as you can see, to any document really. I can define a description of this type. So now that we explored all of this, the other interesting outcome is that a designer could focus on designing a document using the pagination and the role map. Now, if a designer wants to take into account designing for a particular format or device, can describe the document and both the pagination and the role map. If the designer does so, she will be able to design a document that fits a particular class of devices. I'm saying class because, as you have seen from the examples, I can always refer to my sizes on percentages or relative sizes to the outer container. So if the layout of the document is preset and the device size variation is not that great, the document will adjust itself relatively nicely. So the overall user experience will be maintained and will be fairly good. But this will require the designer to do quite a lot of work. And the problem is that as soon as the user decides to move to a different device or decides to do something different, even printing on different page sizes or different pages orientations like portrait and landscape, that design may not work well anymore. And yes, scaling is an option and all of this, but it's definitely not bringing the best possible user experience. What if now the designer instead of providing the pagination model and the page layout for the paginated content, just stops at the role map, and he uses the role map as an intent. So what the designer does says, okay, I'm going to tell you what my content and out-of-flow content should go, and then when you decide on what device you want to print or what page format or what rotation you want to do, you're going to find a suitable design that matches as best as possible my role map intent. And so then the device, the printer, the browser, the rendering engine, they will infer the pagination from this role map, and finally they will override both providing a pagination that is suitable and override the role map. Overriding the role map means making the role map compatible to whatever the designer has expressed as an intent. And so to give an example, for instance, let's say my designer has created a document, and then that is the intent she created. So she originally wanted to have the 4 columns document. She wanted the footnotes on the first 2 columns on the left side and then the 2 on the right side. So when I try to create a pagination out of it, all of these, for instance, are valid pagination they can derive from the intent because they both have 4 columns, they both have footnotes, areas A and B, and so on. But you see the column sizes can be different, the footnotes limits can be different. All of those are valid because they are compatible with whatever the role mapper tells me to. But let's go to a more realistic example. So the designer has generated this and delivered this document. This device is, let's say, is a landscape device. What it will do is, considering the size it has, it cannot render in 4 columns because it will be really inconvenient for the user to read. So he decided that the layout which is appropriate for a multi-column and is the 2-column one, no more than 2 columns. And this could be done by dynamically generating the layout or picking up from a library of pre-built layout or designs that have been available for that particular browser or device or printer. And so now we have these 2 columns, 2 footnotes areas document which page, and let's say the pagination is simple. I just repeat this until I ended up with my content. So what the overridden role map will be to simplify the role map, removing the several columns to the 2 columns and maintaining the footnote area as it was. Now, because all of this is expressed in the role map and not in the content, I'm not going to change any of the content at all. I'm completely agnostic to whatever was the content that was referenced from those URIs. And the rendering engine will take that, produce the 2 columns, bring in the content, and whenever the footnotes will happen, we'll place the footnotes in there. There are limitations, of course. If for instance, your GAP was designed using an SVG that was for a very large document and you haven't made it scalable or you haven't made it like as a picture, this may not work. But in general, if the document is designed with the idea that can be delivered to several devices, this model should work fairly well. And again, the user experience will be, I have a multi-column document, is tailored for my landscape view, and is pretty much consistent to a 4-column document that I could have seen if I had a larger device. So the designer wish or intent has been preserved as much as was possible. It's definitely better than something mangled into a single area with no footnotes, or the footnotes embedded into the text or whatever. And now let's go to an even more extreme. I have a very tiny device and I can only present it on portrait. So again, the device can only present one single column, doesn't have the way of presenting multiple columns, because if it does so, it will become non-legible. And the pagination that is presented here is fairly simple, but again, at least preserve the wish of maintaining a footnote representation. And the overread and roll map is extremely trivial now, because I only have, a content goes in one column, and then I have a representation in a column that goes to a footnote. So conclusions. First of all, separating the pagination concerns and the page sequences concern from the role map give me the flexibility and the possibility of interchanging those without having to touch and consider the content at all. The second thing is that my role map now carries a concept of intent that wasn't available before. And devices, browsers can try to interpret that intent, inferring what type of layout is the best suitable, creating it, selecting from a library, applying any techniques. I'm not discussing how smart they can be in achieve that. And once they've decided what to do, it's very easy for these devices to override the role map, because they can just refer to the same thing. This part is where I was talking before, that does require to have a sort of standardization on the nomenclature. Otherwise, I won't find whatever is you call ABC into any of the templates I may have. And that's it. Thank you.
We've got time for a question or two. Do we have any questions for Fabio? Don't be shy. No questions? Okay. Well, Fabio, I have a couple for you. Actually, you answered the one that I was going to ask on the last slide, but I'll ask it anyway to see what the limits are. I was looking at how dynamic the layouts are to contradictions. So if you've got flowed text that is not going to be parsable and fit into one of the columns, and it seems like in that case you would divide it up into a single column. Do you have intelligence in there that knows how to correspond images that won't fit into the marginalia, et cetera?
Right. So this will be something that will be handled at the composition engine. So what does it mean is that the device has chosen a layout which cannot fit the content, and what is going to happen is that there could be two things. The overflow will force it to bring a simpler layout in, or modify the existing one to accommodate the content. So the marginalia area, for instance, can be reduced or removed, or can be changed into a float, or something that allows me the other content to be float around instead of taking the entire size. But again, this is at the rendering engine, so I will discover this when I'm trying to paginate, and if I cannot, I can go back, step back and say, okay, this page model doesn't work for the content I have. I need to switch and select another one.
Great.
Okay.
Questions from the audience? So then the other one for me would be, what are the limitations for your model to bring in, say, an aesthetics engine at the front end that derives content? How, because I saw that you had some flexible building the designs. How are you matching those or making those that most closely fit to the aesthetics that were defined by the designer?
So this is, as you've seen, this is a fairly loose coupling, right? The designer can define everything, can design the page and the role map and everything. And if he does so, he will get exactly, similar to current tools, and actually even more complicated layout, closer to the static layout designs. But if the designer has no idea of the device set is gonna go, the ability that she has now is to create a role map that uses the standard potentially standard, because they don't exist yet, but the potentially standard notations or naming conventions that will allow at least the content to float in the right place. One interesting example, there is all this proliferation of print page in HTML. I go to a separate link and I get a page that doesn't have all the clutter of banners and navigation, all this kind of stuff. The designer could, with the role intent, basically express what content goes to a paginated printed material, and that role map will allow me already to automatically remove all the clutter, because I won't have that into the content that I float into my page in the first place. And so if I select subset of the page I'm gonna use, I don't need, as a designer, to create yet another HTML page or having another CSS styling that goes and remove all the divs and hide all the divs and all the stuff that are not gonna be used.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the next paper. Another hand for Fabio, please.